Imagine for a moment that everything you've been chasing, clarity, strength, belonging, has never actually been outside of you. Not in a relationship, not in a ritual, not in a role. It's been waiting in a place you rarely look, beneath the mental noise and emotional habits that whisper, "You're not there yet." As Emmet Fox once taught, the Christ is not a man in history, it's the divine pattern in you, the eternal mold of spiritual perfection, buried under the rubble of misidentification and fear. It's not something you earn, it's something you remember. So before we journey inward, I invite you to like and subscribe, but only if it truly resonates with your soul. Now stay with me. Don't float away. We're not here to escape reality. We're here to correct it at the root. You've heard phrases like, "made in the image and likeness of God." But what does that mean if your life feels like a contradiction of that image? If you're caught in cycles, sabotages, or stagnation, not because you're lazy or broken, but because you've built your identity on sand? What if I told you your reality bends to the pattern you hold in mind, and that pattern, the one shaping your results, is rarely chosen consciously. It's inherited, absorbed, adopted, then repeated. This is not mystical theory, it's law, not law like rules to obey, but law like gravity, like cause and effect. Your image of yourself is the cause. Your conditions are the effect. No exception. You've been living inside an image, and that image is doing more to determine your life than your efforts, your affirmations, or your prayers. The image wins, every time. So the question becomes, what image are you married to? Let's clear this up. Self-image is not about ego. It's not about arrogance or appearance. It's not even how others see you. Self-image is the mental blueprint that your subconscious mind takes as instruction. It is the script you rehearse silently, even when you smile outwardly. It is the mold from which your emotions, actions, and expectations pour themselves into form. And there is a truth deeper than that mold. Under every false identity lies an indestructible pattern, what Emmet Fox called the Christ within. That's not religious branding, that's spiritual reality. Christ in this context means the divine design, the sacred code, the perfect original from which your true being was copied. It is the mind in you that is unconfused, unafraid, and uncompromised. It never left. But you may have stopped looking. You see, the real work isn't to become divine. You already are. The real work is to rise in consciousness to the level of that design, to peel off the masks, not to punish yourself, but to uncover what's been hidden in plain sight. And here's the power. When you begin to hold that true image steadily, when you begin to identify with it, instead of your wounds or your conditioning, your external world must shift. Not out of magic, but out of law. This is why so many efforts at change fail. You try to act different without seeing yourself differently. You try to speak new truths with an old self-image driving the tone. It doesn't work, not sustainably, because life responds not to what you say, but to who you are being while you say it. That's what alignment means. Not just thinking better thoughts, but syncing your entire vibration with the truth of your original pattern. Let's be blunt. You don't need more external data. You don't need another workshop or ritual or tool unless it helps you see yourself more truly. If it's not bringing you closer to the Christ pattern within, it's a delay dressed as development. Now, I'm not talking about religion. I'm not asking you to worship anything. I'm asking you to remember who you were before the world handed you its scripts, before guilt became identity, before performance became safety, before you made your image out of survival instead of truth. Because that old image, formed in fear, clothed in overthinking, is not just inaccurate, it's incompatible with your evolution. The Christ pattern within you is not interested in helping your false self feel more comfortable. It's interested in replacing it, not violently, but thoroughly. So if there's conflict in your life, contradiction in your results, or confusion in your mind, don't panic. Don't condemn yourself. But do pay attention. Because what you're experiencing is a message. the image you're living from is misaligned with who you truly are. And when the image is off, the experience is off. But when you correct the image, the experience realigns. This is not motivational fluff. This is mechanics. Emmet Fox put it simply, as within, so without, meaning life cannot give you what you haven't first accepted as real on the inside. You can beg, pray, hustle, but if your inner model of self is small, scared, or scattered, the law must reflect that back. So today marks a shift, not through effort alone, but through identification, not through striving, but through seeing clearly. You're not here to improve the old self, you're here to release it, not to decorate the mask, but to dissolve it. And underneath, quiet, steady, eternal, is the design of your true self. It has never been damaged, only hidden. This entire journey will be about bringing that design forward, and not in theory, but in thought, feeling, word, and behavior. Because the pattern doesn't live in books, it lives in you, and it wants expression. So let this be your start, not of self-help, but of self-recall, not of seeking, but of aligning, not of doing, but of becoming again what you never stopped being except in the mirror of your mind. You were not born with a broken image. You were born whole. Before the names, before the punishments, before the mirrors of other people's confusion reflected something distorted back at you. But as time passed, you began to adopt an image that was never yours. You learned to shrink in the presence of criticism. You learned to overachieve in the pursuit of safety. You learned to identify with roles that gave you approval, but not peace. And without realizing it, you began to defend a version of yourself that kept you small. The false image is clever. It doesn't announce itself as false. It wears the voice of reason. It mimics your inner narrator. It adopts the language of your caretakers, your culture, your childhood fears. It whispers things like, "Don't aim too high. This is just how you are. Be grateful, even if you're barely surviving." It uses guilt as a leash and shame as a mask. It tells you your past defines your future. It convinces you that your worth is conditional, on performance, on appearance, on pleasing others. And worst of all, it makes you believe that the truth about you is hidden, inaccessible, or worse, non-existent. But none of that is true. The false image must fall, not because you need to be punished for believing it, but because your life cannot stretch beyond the mold you allow your mind to live in. Let's be clear. You cannot rise while protecting the image that keeps you low. You cannot heal while defending the personality that was built to survive wounding. You cannot embody the Christ pattern while gripping the ego script that fears transformation. This doesn't mean you need to hate your past or scorn the version of yourself that once believed those old ideas. That version was doing what it knew. It was adapting to what it was given. But now you know better. And once you see the image for what it is, a patchwork of reactions, roles, and false loyalties, it starts to lose its grip. That's how healing begins, not with force, but with clarity. When you see that the self-image you've been living from was never chosen consciously, you begin to question it, and that question creates an opening, a crack in the mental armor, a ray of light into the dense cloud of inherited identity. The moment you stop defending the false image is the moment you start remembering who you are. This is why so many people struggle with lasting change. They try to layer new behaviors over an old identity. They chase transformation from the level of personality, not from the seat of the soul. It's like painting over a cracked wall without repairing the foundation. It looks better for a while, but the cracks always return. You don't need a new personality, you need a return to the original pattern. And to do that, the false must fall. But here's the resistance. Your nervous system is addicted to the image it knows, even if it's painful, because pain that's familiar often feels safer than truth that's new. This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And responsibility is not blame. It's the power to respond from a deeper place than your reflexes. It's the willingness to stop outsourcing your identity to memories, moods, or social mirrors. It's the courage to say, "This version of me was built to survive, not to expand, and I am ready to outgrow it." You are not your backstory. You are not your reputation. You are not the voice of that parent, that teacher, that crowd. You are not even the version of yourself that got you through the hardest seasons. That version may have been strong, but now it's outdated. The mind of Christ within you cannot emerge while the mask is still in place. You must choose which voice leads, the voice of the past or the voice of your pattern. There's a cost to letting the false image fall. You'll feel exposed, uncertain, raw. You might feel grief for the version of yourself you protected for years. You might notice parts of your life begin to fall out of alignment. Relationships, routines, or roles that were based on your former image. But don't confuse collapse with chaos. Sometimes a crumbling structure is grace in motion. Let the fall happen. Don't resist the identity collapse. It's how your real self steps forward. You won't be left empty. You'll be cleared. You'll begin to see with clarity the thoughts you've entertained for too long. You'll stop making excuses for behaviors that don't match your values. You'll begin to recognize when the old image tries to reassert itself through fear, avoidance, or subtle self-sabotage. And each time you notice it, you reclaim your power, not by shouting affirmations, not by faking confidence, but by choosing, moment to moment, to align with a deeper truth, one that doesn't need external validation because it was never built on performance. The Christ pattern is not impressed by your resume. It's not shaken by your regrets. It waits, steady, still, inviting. It's not here to shame the old you, it's here to outshine it. Let the false image fall, not as an act of war, but as an act of surrender to something more accurate. You don't need to fix the mask, you need to remove it. And underneath? Not a void, not a blank slate, but a blueprint, a radiant, intelligent, eternal pattern of being that remembers what your mind forgot. You are not here to beg for worth. You are here to reveal it. So drop the weight of who you thought you had to be. Step beyond the identity that fatigue built, that trauma guarded, that ego decorated. Stand where the old image once lived and let the pattern breathe through you. Let it show you what it means to be whole, not in theory, but in practice. The world you live in is not built from concrete or cash. It is constructed, moment by moment, in the invisible workshop of your mind. That's not a metaphor. It's the mechanism. Your experience is a projection of your inner patterning, made solid by agreement, not conscious agreement, always, but felt, repeated, often unconscious alignment. Mind is the mold, life is the casting. Change the mold, and the cast must change. This is not wishful thinking. It's not spiritual optimism. It is the most ancient truth encoded in every mystery tradition, every genuine metaphysical teaching. As you think in the deep places of your being, so shall you become. Not just in temperament, but in circumstance. This is why your self-image is not just some psychological detail. It is the master instruction your mind uses to tell the universe what to form around you. You cannot outrun it. You cannot outperform it. And you will never sustainably rise above the level of self-image you hold as normal. That word is key, normal. Because what you accept as just the way it is, even if painful, forms the parameters of your possibility. You might want something better. You might wish for more peace, more love, more prosperity. But the law does not respond to your desires. It responds to your pattern. And your pattern is governed by what you've accepted as your baseline. That baseline, it's written in thought, repeated thought. Thought so familiar you mistake it for truth. You've been conditioned to believe that life happens to you, that your conditions are random, that your personality is fixed. But Emmet Fox, Neville Goddard, Troward, they all taught what the mystics before them knew. Nothing appears in your life unless it is first permitted by your consciousness. Let that land. This doesn't mean you're to blame for every experience. This means you're involved. And that's powerful. That means the locus of change is not out there. It's in your image of self, your habitual agreement with either truth or illusion. Most people try to change their world without changing their mold. It's like reshaping water without altering the cup. You get caught in effort. You force new behaviors. You chase more knowledge. But until the inner mold is adjusted, life keeps congealing into the same outcomes, dressed in different disguises. That's why breakthroughs fade. That's why new affirmations stop working. That's why your circumstances rebound to the same set point, because the mold hasn't changed. Let's say this plainly. If you think from lack, you reinforce lack. If you think from wholeness, you invite wholeness. This doesn't mean you deny your current challenges. It means you stop anchoring your identity in them. You begin to build a new mold, thought by thought, not from fantasy, but from alignment with the eternal. And the only blueprint that holds under pressure is the Christ pattern within. It's not a fantasy self. It's not ideal you. It's not the perfect version others told you to become. It's the real, original design that existed before trauma layered on coping strategies, before fear hardened into habits, before culture handed you roles to play. And the first thing that mold requires is mental honesty, not judgment, not shame. Just the willingness to see, what have I been thinking as? What do I believe is just the way it is? What version of myself do I unconsciously serve each time I avoid, react, or shrink? When you see the old mold clearly, you stop feeding it unconsciously, and when you stop feeding it, its power begins to fade. But this isn't just about stopping thought patterns. This is about replacing them. You must construct the new mold, not just intellectually, but energetically. And that begins with thought, not surface thought, but feeling-backed thought. Thought you believe, thought you entertain in the quiet moments, thought you return to without force, thought that feels like home in your nervous system. This is what the ancients meant when they said, as within, so without. It was never mystical metaphor. It was psychological law. So ask yourself now, not as an exercise, but as a pattern check. What version of you has been doing the thinking? What image do you automatically return to when things get hard? Is it the pattern of Christ or the habit of survival? This matters, because the mind is never still. It is always forming, always shaping. And it will shape according to whatever you hold most consistently. This is why you don't just need better thoughts. You need a better point of origin. You need to think from the pattern, not just about it. You need to inhabit the mold of wholeness so deeply that the old thoughts can't find their way back in. And that takes more than moments of inspiration. It takes daily mental posture, deliberate agreement. So from this point forward, observe your thinking, not to control it, but to recalibrate it. See where your mold still reflects fear, scarcity, unworthiness, and without panic, begin to adjust. Catch the thoughts that reinforce the old mold. Gently override them, not with hype, but with truth, not with fantasy, but with clarity. Build the mold of mind that matches the pattern of Christ, and life will mirror it back, not overnight, not always with fireworks, but with precision, with inevitability. Because law doesn't play favorites, it plays patterns, and the mold you choose is the life you get. There is a sharp but often missed distinction between wishing for truth and thinking from truth. One flirts with the pattern, the other inhabits it, and the law only responds to the latter. Most people confuse desire with alignment. They assume that because they want peace, they are attracting peace. Because they hope for abundance, they are aligned with it. But that's not how mental law works. It doesn't read your wishes, it reads your agreement. You may pray for healing while still identifying as the broken one. You may affirm prosperity while seeing yourself as someone trying to escape lack. You may visualize love while deep down believing you are unworthy of being seen. The law doesn't respond to the image on your vision board. It responds to the image stamped on your consciousness. To think from truth means to adopt it as your point of origin, not as an aspiration, but as a premise. It becomes the framework through which you interpret life. And when your mind begins to operate on that wavelength, the entire structure of your experience shifts accordingly. This is what Troward called the divine ideal, not an ideal in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of spiritual fact. The blueprint, the mold, the unwavering standard of what is real, regardless of appearances. You don't bend truth to meet your mood, you raise your thinking to meet the truth. This requires discipline, not dogma. You're not trying to believe harder. You're retraining your mental posture to reject any thought that cannot coexist with the pattern. That means you stop indulging thoughts that feel familiar, but are fundamentally untrue. Thoughts that shrink you, shame you, scatter you. You stop letting them run uninterrupted just because they're old. And you begin to recognize a thought is not harmless just because it's silent. Every thought carries weight. It either builds the inner structure that supports your pattern, or it chips away at it. There is no neutral. So what does thinking from truth actually look like? It means you begin to think, feel, and respond as if the pattern were your current state, not your distant goal. When faced with fear, you ask, what does the pattern know here? When doubt creeps in, you hold, this is not compatible with the blueprint. I don't accept it. You don't argue with the fear. You don't wrestle the doubt. You starve it by refusing to energize it with sustained attention. The Christ pattern does not beg. It does not panic. It does not hustle to prove itself. It simply is. And to the extent that you identify with it, you begin to move like it. This is not arrogance. It is agreement. Arrogance is ego-inflated. Agreement is spirit-remembered. There's no need to shout down every negative thought. That just creates more noise. Instead, you grow silent where those thoughts once ruled. You remove your energy, your interest, your loyalty, and in that silence, the pattern speaks. But it's subtle. It doesn't demand. It invites. That's why many miss it. They're tuned into the volume of the world, not the vibration of truth. They confuse noise for clarity, movement for alignment. But when you begin to think from the pattern consistently, you notice the shift. Not always immediately in your circumstances, but instantly in your center. You feel less shaken, less hungry for external proof, less entangled in other people's projections. You begin to sense that what you are is enough, not because you've stopped growing, but because you're growing from truth, not toward it. This is the heart of true transformation, not behavior modification, but mental relocation. You're no longer trying to reach the pattern. You're thinking from it, being from it. And the law, which cannot be mocked or fooled, begins to respond accordingly. Remember, thought is not measured by how positive it sounds, but by how aligned it is with spiritual principle. A thought like, I must earn love may sound responsible, but it is incompatible with the pattern. A thought like, I'm not there yet may sound humble, but it keeps you exiled from truth. The law knows no exceptions. It reflects the inner image, not the outer effort. So begin now, not later, not when you feel better, to agree mentally with the pattern. If a thought doesn't match it, it doesn't belong. If a feeling doesn't feed it, let it pass. You are not here to argue for your limitations. You are here to awaken the pattern, not as a concept, but as your native frequency. And that awakening doesn't wait for perfect moods or ideal timing. It begins the moment you think from truth, no matter how softly, no matter how briefly. Because even a glimpse of that alignment has the power to reshape the mold. And once the mold shifts, the cast must follow. Emotion is not a side effect. It is the current that gives life to thought, the voltage that activates the pattern, the silent fuel behind the image you carry. Without emotion, thought is static, an idea on a shelf. But once feeling enters, thought becomes instruction. This is where most people get stuck. They try to think new thoughts, say new affirmations, visualize new realities, but their emotional energy still loops around old conclusions. They rehearse abundance while still feeling like the rejected child. They speak of love while still feeling fundamentally unsafe. And they wonder why nothing shifts. Because emotion, not just thought, is what imprints the mold. You can't skip the feeling and expect the pattern to activate. Now, don't confuse this with sentimentality or dramatics. We're not talking about crying your way into alignment. We're talking about emotional agreement, that deep, subtle resonance within your nervous system that either affirms or rejects the thought you're offering. If you say, "I am whole," but still feel fragmented, the law hears fragmentation. If you speak, "I am powerful," but tremble with unworthiness, the signal is crossed, and the result will reflect the stronger of the two. Always. So here's the breakthrough. You must bring feeling into congruence with truth, not by force, but by exposure. Emotional exposure to the pattern, to what is real beneath the fear. Because the pattern doesn't just live in thought, it breathes through your felt experience of being. This is where memory and trauma try to hijack the signal. Your nervous system, conditioned by past experience, may reject truth not because it's false, but because it's unfamiliar. It clings to the false image because that image is encoded with emotional survival. And survival, even if miserable, is familiar. It feels safer than expansion. So when you try to feel something new, peace, power, worth, it may feel false at first. That's not proof of its inaccuracy. That's just proof of the emotional program you're outgrowing. And that's exactly why you must practice the feeling of truth. Not pretend it, not perform it. Practice it. Emotional alignment is not passive. It is a skill. A willingness to step into the resonance of the pattern again and again until your system learns to hold it. You do this by rehearsing the feeling tone of truth. You don't just say, "I am whole." You pause and breathe into what wholeness feels like, where it sits in the body, how it alters your posture, your facial expression, your rhythm of thought. You don't just affirm, "I am loved." You trace the feeling of being unconditionally seen and supported until the nervous system recognizes it as an option. This is not fantasy. It's emotional recalibration, and it is essential. Because the law responds to the full signal. Thought plus feeling, idea plus atmosphere, belief plus vibration. Emmet Fox said it plainly. Your outer world is a reflection of your habitual thinking. But we must add, your habitual emotional state is the ink that writes that reflection. You can't just adjust what you say, you must adjust what you feel safe feeling. Let that sink in. Some people don't fail at success because they don't believe in it. They fail because they're not emotionally safe with it. Joy feels foreign, power feels exposed, peace feels boring. So they unconsciously recreate struggle, not because they love it, but because their emotional mold is shaped for it. And this isn't your fault. You didn't choose your early emotional conditioning, but you can choose whether to let it define your self-image now. That's the spiritual work, emotional congruence with truth. You must let the image you hold become emotionally real. Let the pattern not just live in your intellect, but radiate through your body. Let it affect how you breathe, how you speak, how you walk into rooms. This is how embodiment begins, not through acting, but through felt agreement. That's why stillness matters, not as a mystical ritual, but as emotional calibration. When you pause and hold a true image, not just think it, but feel it, you begin to teach your body what safety in truth feels like. You begin to make peace with peace. You begin to fall in love with strength. You begin to tolerate worthiness. And in that shift, the mold changes. And with it, everything else. You can have the right words and still be stuck. You can quote every teacher and still live from fear. Because the law doesn't respond to what you recite. It responds to what you radiate. So this is the invitation. Let yourself feel what the pattern feels. Let yourself imagine what it's like to think from that place. Not just with your mind, but with your entire being. Sit in the frequency of truth until it becomes the most familiar feeling in the room. And then watch the world mirror it back. Words shape worlds, but not just the ones you speak aloud. The most potent words are the ones you whisper internally without witnesses. They are the quiet phrases that circulate beneath your conscious awareness, looping like a hidden soundtrack, informing every reaction, expectation, and emotional posture. This is the inner word, and yes, it becomes flesh, not because of magic, because of law. The moment you entertain a thought with emotional charge, you begin a process. That thought echoes, finds reinforcement, wraps itself in feeling, and forms your inner narrative. And that narrative, repeated, becomes identity. That identity becomes behavior. Behavior hardens into experience. Experience shapes perception. And before long, the world around you seems to prove the very script you forgot you were writing. But here's the twist. The world isn't proving anything. It's reflecting what you hold as normal within. This is why merely talking differently doesn't change your life. You can shout affirmations, sing hymns, rehearse mantras, but if the inner word remains rooted in fear, your results will follow that inner signature. The law does not respond to volume. It responds to vibration. And the vibration of your inner word is determined by one thing: identification. Who are you being as you speak to yourself? Not who do you want to be. Not who are you pretending to be. Who are you being in the quiet spaces? If your inner word is still, "I must fix myself," then your outer world must echo that premise with endless problems to fix. If your inner word is, "I don't belong," then no matter how inclusive your environment, something in you will interpret rejection. If your inner word is, "I am not enough," then even abundance will feel threatening, because it contradicts the mold. This is not punishment. This is precision. The law is not judging you. It's responding with complete accuracy to the word you continually project inward. So what's your real self-talk? Not the phrases you recite in the mirror once a day. The ones that surface when you're disappointed, when you fail, when you're praised, when you're ignored. Those moments reveal the tone of your true inner narrative, and that tone is the tone of your life. That's why scripture, teachers, and mystics alike have emphasized the creative power of the word. Emmet Fox wrote, "The word is the thought expressed, and thoughts, when expressed consistently, become conditions." So what do? We don't argue with the old word. We replace it. We build a new tone, one phrase at a time, one micro moment at a time, until the soundscape of our inner world matches the pattern we've been called to reflect. This isn't about positive thinking. This is about accurate identification. When you speak from the pattern, your words carry weight. They cut through distortion, not because they're louder, but because they're aligned. The pattern never says, "I hope I am." It says, "I am." It doesn't plead, it proclaims. And when you begin to echo that tone, not as a performance but from identification, you begin to author a different script. One where your self-talk is not a battlefield, but a sanctuary. One where the inner voice doesn't attack or flatter, but reminds. You won't get this perfect overnight. You will still catch the old words rising up, the shaming, the doubting, the disclaimers. That's not failure. That's feedback. It's the system revealing where the old image still lingers. Use those moments. Don't just silence the old word. Overwrite it. Replace the lie not with fantasy, but with spiritual fact. The pattern doesn't stutter. Neither should you. When fear whispers, "I can't," you don't shout, "Yes, I can." Like a cheerleader, you respond calmly but clearly. "This thought is incompatible with my truth." I will not energize it. When the echo says, "This is too big for me," you don't pretend to be brave. You return to the mold and answer, "Nothing that is mine by design can harm me. I was built for this. This isn't arrogance. This is responsibility. The willingness to stop outsourcing your tone of mind to moods, memories, or media. You are the author of your internal script, and every word you allow to echo shapes the mold. So speak carefully, not out of fear, but out of power. Refuse to participate in narratives that distort your pattern. Refuse to let familiarity dictate your tone. And if you forget, return. Again and again. Until your baseline inner word no longer sabotages, but strengthens. Until your internal voice stops echoing the world and begins to echo the pattern. Because once the inner word aligns, the outer form must follow. It has no choice. There comes a point when the image you've built, layer by layer, can no longer carry you forward. It doesn't collapse all at once. It begins with a small hesitation, a moment where the thoughts that once defined you ring hollow, where your practiced behaviors feel strangely robotic, where the mirror reflects something tired, not in the body, but in the soul. This is the beginning of the unraveling. To break the spell of identity is not a poetic metaphor, it's an excruciating clarity. You realize that the version of yourself you've clung to, the one who gets things done, who survives, who plays safe, who keeps the peace or stirs the drama, has never been the real you. It has been a strategy, a shadow that did its best to protect the child you were when no one else could. But strategy can only sustain so long before it becomes a prison. You can feel it, that dull weight behind your ribs, that subtle sense that something essential has gone numb. You keep talking, working, posting, replying, but there's a hollowness under the surface, a quiet death, not of the body, of the true self buried under roles you no longer believe in. This is not failure, this is awakening. But before rebirth, there is always the death of the mask. To break the spell is to watch your old names dissolve, not just the ones others gave you, but the ones you gave yourself. The achiever, the fixer, the outsider, the strong one, the misunderstood, even the spiritual one. These are costumes stitched together from pain, praise, and pattern. And now they begin to fall apart. It hurts. Not because you want to keep them, but because they've kept you from feeling the full absence you never resolved. And now that absence is in the room, the silence of what you could have been if you hadn't been so busy being what you were told to be. You don't need a breakdown. You need a break in identification. And sometimes life gives you that, not with permission, but with pressure. The relationship falls apart. The success goes sour. The mask slips, and suddenly everyone sees behind it. You're left exposed, embarrassed, unsheltered. But that exposure, it's not destruction, it's revelation. When you stop pretending, the true pattern doesn't emerge in fanfare. It emerges in stillness, in the terrifying space between what you no longer are and what you haven't yet embodied. That's where most people quit, not because they're weak, but because that space feels like death. Fox once described it as spiritual desolation, the desert of the soul where nothing moves, nothing responds, and God seems utterly silent. But it's in that silence that the spell of identity fully cracks. The voice you always thought was you begins to quiet, and what rises in its place is something foreign but familiar, something ancient, something steady, something whole. You must let the spell break fully. Stop trying to reattach the mask when it slips. Stop reaching back for the old lines, the old explanations. They won't work anymore. The play has ended. The character is dismissed. And when that dismissal is complete, you will feel a moment of terror, then emptiness, then light. Not blinding light, not the Hollywood flash of awakening, but the kind of light that comes through cracks in old walls. It warms slowly. It fills from within, and you realize you're not rebuilding, you're returning. There's nothing left to prove, no one left to impress. The story you've defended so fiercely no longer needs a narrator. It can fall, and in its place, the pattern begins to breathe. But first, the rise must collapse. The false strength must give way. You must stop being the clever version of yourself long enough to hear the voice that never needed performance, the voice beneath the survival, the self behind the survival. That's where the Christ pattern waits, not in your triumphs, in your surrender, not in your perfection, in your pause. When you finally let the old self lie down, you hear it, the pulse of your original design, steady and unchanged. You don't have to earn it. You only have to stop competing with it. Let the spell break. Let the identity unravel. Let the image die, because what remains is not the end. It is the beginning you've never met in full. The pattern does not interfere, it doesn't push, it doesn't rescue, it responds, quietly, precisely, without hesitation and without preference. This is the law, not a divine personality hovering overhead, but the impartial activity of mind responding to its own impress. Whatever you impress upon it with consistency and feeling, it mirrors, not because it favors you, because it functions. Many wait for a breakthrough as though heaven will bend to desperation. They mistake pleading for power. They think if they beg long enough, cry hard enough, convince the universe of their sincerity, then life will finally shift. But this isn't how law operates. The Christ mind isn't moved by panic. It is activated by alignment. That's the sting. When you realize how long you've prayed from fear, declared from lack, visualized while secretly doubting. You see clearly, maybe for the first time, that you've been asking for change while anchoring in the opposite pattern, and the law, flawless in its operation, has delivered accordingly. The law responds. It does not rescue. And in that truth is both terrifying responsibility and immeasurable freedom. If you're waiting for a sign, you are confessing misalignment. The pattern doesn't beg for confirmation. It generates expression. The moment you drop the act of waiting and begin to assume the pattern is real, your world begins to contour around that assumption, not immediately, always, but inevitably. Law must honor what is impressed with feeling and persistence. This is not cold doctrine. This is mercy at its most raw. Because if law played favorites, if it responded only to the righteous, the clever, the chosen, then your past would be your prison. But because law responds only to pattern, you are free in every moment to alter your trajectory, not by force, by agreement. What are you in agreement with right now? That's the only real measure of your spiritual power. Not how much you know, not how many books you've read or truths you can quote. What you consistently assume to be real, that is your prayer. That is your offering. That is what law hears. This is why Emmet Fox insisted that we stop treating God as a magician. The divine is not here to break its own laws for your comfort. It is here to honor its design. And that design places the creative authority in your own thought and feeling. You are not a victim of mind. You are its operator. And the mind's contents, the images, beliefs, expectations you house, dictate what you call reality. So if you want rescue, look to alignment. If you want movement, look to mental position. Nothing can find you that is out of alignment with your pattern, not because it is being withheld, but because it cannot exist at a frequency you do not occupy. To keep praying for peace while refusing to think as peace is not devotion, it's delay. To keep visualizing abundance while secretly affirming lack is not optimism, it's contradiction, and contradiction cannot yield congruent results. But once you become still enough to catch yourself when you notice the dissonance between what you claim and what you truly believe, you reclaim your power. You stop negotiating with reality and begin shaping it. The law doesn't ask, "Are you ready?" It answers the question, "What is this person radiating now?" So you must choose, again and again, to move from passive want to active embodiment. This isn't pretending, it's aligning. When you speak, speak as if the pattern were real. When you think, think from the truth, not about it. When you feel, feel into the state that matches your spiritual origin, not your historical script. This is what it means to walk by principle, not panic. It may feel raw at first, empty even, because so much of your life may have been constructed around the assumption that rescue would come from outside. And now you're left with the quiet command to rise from within. No lightning bolt, no divine override, just the voice within you saying, "You are the image, you are the cause, you are the gate." And as you live from that knowing, things will begin to shift, not always in the ways you expect, but in the ways that serve the pattern you're now embodying. Doors will close because they don't match. People will disappear because they don't recognize you anymore. Longings will fade because they were never yours to begin with. The law clears as it constructs. It removes as it reorients. It says yes to your new mold and no to everything that opposes it. So stop pleading for mercy. Begin living in agreement with truth. The law does not rescue. It reflects. And what it reflects is not your effort, but your assumption. Christ is not a personality. To believe it is to forever place your power outside yourself. To worship an image of perfection rather than to become the expression of it. And as long as you project Christ onto a historical figure alone, whether Jesus, Buddha, or any so-called enlightened one, you remain separated from the only place it was ever meant to live, in you. This is not heresy. This is the foundation of all authentic spiritual instruction. The Christ is not a man. It is a mind, a state of consciousness, the eternal pattern of divine identity, the perfect image of what you truly are beneath conditioning, beneath sin, beneath the inherited shame of being born into a world that told you your light was dangerous. Jesus was not an exception. He was a demonstration. Not a relic to be adored, but a mirror to be remembered. Greater things shall you do, he said, not because he flattered his followers, but because he understood. The pattern is not bound to one body. It is the structure of being itself. Your task is not to revere the model, but to awaken to the mold. The tragic error of much modern belief is that it teaches you to worship what you were meant to embody, to pray to a force you already house, to fear the very energy designed to liberate you. This keeps you small while thinking you're humble. It makes you obedient without ever making you free. But the Christ doesn't seek followers. It seeks form. It wants to live through you, speak through you, decide, act, breathe through you, not to erase your uniqueness, but to fulfill it. The Christ mind doesn't flatten you into a spiritual clone. It expands you into the truest expression of your original design. The Christ doesn't demand that you mimic ancient behavior. It invites you to let go of imitation altogether and move into direct identification. You are not called to copy. You are called to become. That means seeing the Christ not as something outside to reach for, but as the core identity already within you, the seed behind the ego mask, the blueprint beneath the confusion. It does not arrive in flashes. It's not a spiritual high. It awakens quietly, persistently, every time you refuse to think from fear, every time you override the story of shame, every time you choose principle over performance. And the more you accept this, the more the myth of separation fades. You stop speaking to God like a stranger. You stop waiting for worthiness like it's a future gift. You begin to move through life not as someone becoming spiritual, but as someone remembering they already are. This remembrance strips away the need to perform enlightenment. You don't need to quote scripture. You don't need the right tone, the right robe, the right practice. Those things might be helpful, but they are not required. What's required is that you stop bargaining with truth. And here is that truth. The Christ you admire was never a man you could not touch. It was the aspect of God within that man, showing you what's already planted in yourself. To see Christ rightly is to see yourself differently, to stop saying, He is, and begin saying, I am, not because you are inflating your ego, but because you are dissolving it. You are not Jesus of Nazareth. But the same pattern that animated him lives within you, the same nature, the same mind, not diminished, not altered. And when you accept that, not as theology but as fact, you stop waiting for life to change and begin becoming the change itself. The false humility falls away. The hiding ends. The voice that says, "Who am I to hold this much light?" is finally replaced with the only true answer, "Who am I not to?" You realize the greatest dishonor to Christ is not doubt, it is delay. It is placing this divine pattern on a shelf and calling it sacred, while never daring to live from it. But now you know. You are not apart from the pattern. You are its vehicle. And while your past may tremble at the weight of that truth, your soul exhales, because it has been waiting for this moment since the beginning. The Christ is not far, it never was. It was you, before the fear, beneath the masks, beyond the memory. Now you rise, not in admiration of it, but in union with it. The way you see yourself, the silent picture you carry and reinforce without question, becomes the mirror through which life reflects back to you. Not the mirror of culture, or your upbringing, or your ambitions, but the internal mirror that sits closest to your center. And in that mirror, the shape of your self-perception becomes the blueprint for what you're permitted to experience. You've been trained, perhaps without knowing it, to see yourself through fractured glass. Maybe the cracks came from early rejection, maybe from a parent who didn't see you, a teacher who mislabeled you, or a religion that only offered you dignity if you earned it. Over time, you began to accept those distortions as part of the reflection, not because they felt right, but because they were all you saw. But that mirror lies, not maliciously, just consistently. It reflects what's placed before it, and if the image is distorted by fear, trauma, or conditioning, the mirror faithfully returns distortion. The task is not to repair the mirror, it is to change what stands before it. When you begin to step into the image of the Christ mind, not as a concept, but as an actual frame of reference, the mirror does not resist. It responds. The shift is not instant in feeling, but it is absolute in structure. The law begins responding to what you now assume to be true, even if the echo of the old image still hums in the background. This is not easy, because as the old image starts to dissolve, you'll feel a strange vacancy, a moment where you look into yourself and don't yet recognize what's there. You're no longer fully identified with the past version, but you're not fully standing in the new image either. It's a spiritual vertigo. You're hovering between identities. And in that space, things go quiet. You may expect joy. What you get is silence. You may expect power. What you get is disorientation. This is the break. The mind wants to recoil, to return to the familiar image, even if it hurt. The heart aches for the comfort of what used to be, even when it no longer fits. You're tempted to interpret this in-between as failure. But it is the birth canal of transformation, the moment just before the mirror shatters, not because it broke, but because it no longer matches what stands in front of it. And in that break, the dead feeling arrives, not depression, not despair, but a flatness that follows the collapse of everything false. You are standing in the ruins of the old identity, unsure if the next version will speak. There is no light in this space, just the echo of your old voice, fading, the loss of old motivations, the death of effort. This is not punishment. This is necessary. You cannot rush it. You cannot paint over it. You must stand still and let the last illusions dissolve. Fox wrote of this with terrifying precision. The soul who has emptied itself of old falsehoods and now waits in the dark, unsure if anything will rise in its place. No divine voice, no thunder, just the stillness, the waiting. But something does rise, not loud, not all at once, but steady. The mirror begins to reflect differently, not because you forced it to, but because you no longer bring the old image to it. And what appears is not the ego's ideal. It's quieter, firmer, real. The face of your pattern, calm, clear, unbothered. Not perfect in human terms, but incorruptible in essence. You begin to recognize that this image, this presence, is not what you've tried to become. It's what has always been waiting to be chosen. And when you identify with it long enough, the world has no choice but to align. People respond differently. Events shift. The same decisions take on different outcomes, not because reality changed, but because the self seeing it changed. You do not fight the old image. You simply stop standing in its shape. And what replaces it is not performance, but precision. You were never meant to keep fixing yourself. You were meant to see yourself truly, clearly, through the mirror of divine selfhood. Once that seeing stabilizes, once the emotional reflexes tied to the old identity dissolve, the Christ mind becomes not an aspiration, but a new normal. That is when life begins to feel coherent, not painless, but aligned. Not always easy, but unquestionably clear. Pressure doesn't arrive to crush you. It arrives to reveal you. Not to punish what's wrong, but to press to the surface what's hidden. Most of us spend our lives trying to avoid this pressure, mistaking it for danger, interpreting it as failure. We grip routines, relationships, old assumptions, not because they serve us, but because they shield us from the heat. But spiritual law will not let what is false remain comfortable forever. When the pattern begins to rise, anything built on distortion must come into tension. The part of you that wants truth meets the part of you that still clings to safety, and that collision creates friction. Suddenly, life applies pressure, not randomly, not cruelly, but specifically, to the point of misalignment, to the area that refuses to let go. You don't get to ascend into your pattern without pressure. You don't get to say, "I want clarity," and then keep negotiating with confusion. You don't get to invoke your divine image and stay fused to the habits that hide it. Pressure is the invitation. It arrives disguised as inconvenience, as delay, as disappointment, as the breakup, the failure, the unexpected silence. But underneath each one is the same opportunity. Drop the false pattern or be broken by it. Not in the soul, in the ego, in the identity that refuses to yield. This is where the break comes again, not a single dramatic collapse, but a deep internal snapping of something that can no longer hold. The structure of effort gives way. The identity built on approval, performance, or predictability begins to tremble. And for a moment it feels like something inside you is dying. It is, and it must. Because the version of you that can survive in alignment is not the same version that adapted to survive in fear. That former self did its job. It got you through. But it cannot take you into the pattern. The temptation and pressure is to retreat, to harden, to defend the old self just long enough to make the discomfort stop. You'll want to justify, to blame, to escape into distraction or old habits that used to numb the ache. But if you stay still, if you allow the discomfort to complete its work without trying to manage it, you will hear something beneath the noise. The pattern doesn't panic in pressure. It doesn't tighten. It speaks low, sure, certain. It says, "This too serves me." Not in theory, in practice. That's when the rise begins again, not in triumph, but in stillness. You remember that nothing real is being threatened, only the image you no longer need. The pressure is not here to destroy. It is here to separate what was built in distortion from what is born of clarity. Fox called this the refiner's fire, not a fire of condemnation, but of transformation. It doesn't burn you. It burns what is not you. You feel lighter, not because your life is easier, but because the weight of performance is gone. The constant need to prove, to defend, to maintain an image begins to fall away. In its place, simplicity, sobriety, peace that doesn't shout. You begin to meet pressure with poise, not forced stillness, but a deeper knowing, that if it's shaking, it means something untrue is being tested. And whatever doesn't survive was never part of the pattern anyway. So let the pressure come. Not as an enemy, but as proof of movement. It means the image is shifting. It means the signal is clearing. It means you are no longer trying to carry a life that your soul outgrew. Don't brace. Don't shrink. Open. Let the false identity break under the weight of truth. Let the new shape form without your control. This is not collapse. This is calibration. The pressure is not against you. It is the hand of the law, realigning everything that was once distorted back into congruence. You prayed for transformation. This is the answer. Surrender is not weakness. It is the first act of true power. but not the kind of power we're taught to respect. Loud, controlled, impenetrable. The power in surrender is quiet, unshakable, rooted in something that no longer needs validation. You stop negotiating with what is already done in principle. You stop trying to force outcomes with a white-knuckled mind. And you let the pattern have its way, not by collapsing into passivity, but by aligning with what has already been decided in spirit. Most people surrender only when exhausted. They give up in despair and call it letting go. But that's not surrender, that's collapse. And it leaves the door wide open for resentment to creep in later, disguised as regret. Real surrender is not an escape from effort. It is the refinement of effort. A choice to direct your energy only toward what matches the pattern and to withdraw it completely from everything that doesn't. That means not chasing what isn't yours, not clinging to what's expired, not begging for things that conflict with your design. It means trusting the pattern enough to release your grip on anything that was built to maintain the false self. You will be tempted to keep one foot in control, to micromanage the timeline, to surrender with terms and conditions. But the pattern doesn't bargain, it invites, it waits. And the moment you stop asking it to accommodate your fear, it begins to move. This movement is not dramatic. Sometimes it comes as a release in your chest, sometimes as silence after a long battle in your thoughts. It doesn't always come with relief. It often comes with grief. Because to surrender fully, you have to mourn the identity that no longer serves you. You have to say goodbye to a version of yourself you once trusted with your safety. There is sadness in that. A sharp moment of absence, like being in a room where the furniture has been cleared out, but the shape of it still lingers in the dust. You miss what never truly fit. You ache for a pattern of effort that kept you distracted from the hollowness underneath. And now that you've stopped pretending to be okay with that weight, you feel exposed. This is when it gets quiet, not calm, quiet. The mind stops shouting, the heart stops explaining. You're left in the naked presence of what is, and it feels like standing on the edge of a great uncharted space. There is no clear path forward, just a growing certainty that the one behind you has ended. Fox knew this silence well. He called it the great stillness before manifestation, a place where all control has been surrendered and all resistance disarmed, but nothing visible has yet changed. It is the space between asking and becoming, between effort and embodiment, between fear and form. Here is where faith becomes something other than a concept. Here is where you learn that trust isn't about believing everything will go your way. It's about knowing that who you truly are has never been touched by the outcome. When you surrender into the pattern, you stop asking life to match your ego. You begin to ask if your ego ever matched life. You look back at all the things you tried to build from force and see the cracks. You remember the energy it took to hold together what was never meant to stand. And you feel the first tremor of peace. Not the peace that comes from winning, but the one that comes from no longer needing to win. Now you are no longer pleading, you are aligned. Now your effort is not frantic, it is precise. Now your desire is not desperate, it is grounded in design. You begin to walk differently, not because the world has changed, but because your posture has. You stop bending toward everything that once made you feel enough. You stop adjusting yourself to fit someone else's chaos. You stop performing spirituality for people who never asked you to be whole in the first place. And in that stillness, the pattern breathes through you. Decisions become clearer, not easier, but cleaner. Your yes and no longer come from fear of rejection, but from clarity about your origin. You've stopped fighting, not because you've quit, because the war was never real. It was just the noise of a self-image defending its illusion. Now you rest, not in passivity, but in principle. You no longer flinch when things shake. You know what is built on the pattern cannot be destroyed. And what isn't will fall anyway. Surrender doesn't make you smaller, it makes you sharper. You don't disappear. You reappear without the mask. There comes a moment where your inner shift must step into motion, where what you've seen in stillness must walk. The pattern, once glimpsed and honored, now demands embodiment, not in ceremony, not in speech, in action, in rhythm, in the daily visible structure of your life. This is where spiritual maturity begins. You've surrendered. You've seen through the mask. You've touched the deadness beneath your old identity and stood in the silence that followed. But the journey is not complete until that new internal structure governs behavior. It's not enough to feel different. The world changes when you move differently. Acting as the pattern acts doesn't mean pretending to be fearless. It means letting truth become your default response. It means choosing thought, word, and motion that reflect your alignment, not your anxiety. This is not performance, it is congruence. When you move from truth, the energy behind your actions changes. You stop forcing conversations to get approval. You stop hesitating when it's time to claim something already yours. You stop shrinking around other people's discomfort. But more than that, your invisible choices begin to shift. How you speak to yourself in small moments, what you accept without resistance, how you hold your posture when no one is looking, the subtle choreography of a soul that no longer bends to fear. This is not a call to perfection. This is a call to consistency. The Christ mind doesn't posture. It doesn't escalate to prove its point. It doesn't hesitate in self-betrayal just to keep the peace. It acts with precision, with peace that knows itself, with a clarity that is quiet and strong. You'll find yourself tested. Old habits will whisper. Certain situations will pull at your reflexes. You'll be invited to play the old role again, to overextend, to apologize for your radiance, to delay what you know is right because someone else isn't ready. These are the moments that matter most, not the dramatic revelations, but the ordinary crossroads. Do you answer the message or avoid it? Do you act from the old fear or the new truth? Do you stand in the pattern even when your body shakes and your voice wavers? This is not about the result. It's about the origin, the place in you that the action comes from. The pattern acts without strain. It doesn't push. It doesn't retreat. It simply expresses fully and freely whatever truth it knows. And the more you allow that energy to govern your motion, the more the world rearranges. You'll notice it in the smallest things, people responding differently, conflicts dissolving before they start. Opportunities showing up not because you chase them, but because you match them. The law has no bias, but it does have fidelity. It always flows toward alignment, and when your actions reflect that alignment, life begins to mirror not your effort, but your integrity. Acting from the pattern also means letting go of habits that once earned you belonging. The people-pleasing, the deflection, the subtle self-doubt embedded in how you walk, speak, delay. You'll feel grief as those patterns fade, because even dysfunction can feel like home. But if you do not act differently, the image cannot solidify, no matter how deeply you see it. There is no reward in spiritual insight that never leaves the mind. You must carry the pattern into your relationships, your decisions, your finances, your rest, your presence, not with drama, with dignity, not with anxiety, with calm insistence, not with spectacle, with steadiness. Because when the pattern lives in motion, it ceases to be an idea, it becomes your atmosphere. And then, even without words, you become the message. Others will sense something has shifted, not because you announce it, but because your presence no longer asks for permission. It radiates clarity. Fox said that demonstration is the proof of truth understood, and understanding in this path is not intellectual, it is behavioral. You know that you've crossed the threshold when your life begins to move to the rhythm of your inner knowing. There's no need to convince anymore, no need to explain. You simply live as the pattern lives. And in that living, the rest of your world aligns or falls away. Living as the pattern isn't a moment of inspiration, it is a discipline. And like any discipline, it must be reinforced. Not out of fear of losing it, but because the world you once agreed with is still echoing its old instructions. That echo doesn't stop just because you've awakened. It keeps calling softly, subtly, in habits, voices, distractions. And if you don't feed the new identity deliberately, the old one will try to reclaim its ground by default. This is why the transformation must be nurtured. You've seen the pattern, you've acted from it. But now comes the real work, reinforcement. Not as pressure, but as posture. Every day, in quiet ways, you re-anchor. Not because the pattern disappears, but because your attention is the magnet. Wherever it rests, identity roots. The mind will still wander. The emotions will still fluctuate. The body will still carry cellular memory of fear, lack, rejection. That's not regression, that's data. Feedback from a system adjusting to a new signal. Don't panic when the old thoughts arise. Don't shame yourself when the old doubts resurface. Use them. Let them point you to where the mold is still fragile, still soft, still forming. And return. Repetition is not regression. It is reinforcement. Every time you choose the pattern over the program, you deepen the groove. Every time you decline the temptation to perform or shrink or delay, you make the new identity more familiar than the old one. Eventually, it becomes default. But only if you feed it. That's the mistake many make. They glimpse clarity, ride its wave, but forget that identity is maintained through rhythm. A plant doesn't grow because it was once watered deeply. It grows because it's tended, carefully, faithfully. Your self-image works the same way. Feed it with thought that aligns, with language that reflects who you are now, not who you were, with choices that don't match your history, but your design. Let your actions become a vote for your future self. Let your attention become loyalty to your highest mold. This doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. The willingness to keep showing up, not just when you feel strong, but especially when you feel scattered. The pattern doesn't require mood. It requires agreement. That's how you reinforce it, not by fighting the old identity, but by starving it. You stop entertaining thoughts that center failure. You stop retelling stories that validate limitation. You stop investing energy into explaining yourself to people who only knew your former self. The pattern speaks now. Let it speak often. Let it become the tone of your inner monologue. Let it shape your decisions, your reactions, your expectations. And when the noise of the world grows loud again, you don't panic. You remember that clarity isn't found in escape, but in focus. Fox warned against the illusion of spiritual tourism, chasing light but refusing to build a home in it. That's what this reinforcement requires, building a home. Living in the pattern not as a visitor, but as a resident, making it your address, letting your nervous system settle into the frequency of truth until it becomes boringly familiar. That's the sign of real integration. When the Christ mind is no longer dramatic, no longer a peak experience, it's just how you wake up, how you walk, how you speak, not because you're trying, because you've trained your system to stop reaching for who you are and simply live it. But even then, keep feeding it. The world will still offer contrast, still offer distraction, still invite you back into smaller rooms. You don't fight those rooms, you decline them, gently, repeatedly, not because you're better than them, because they no longer fit. You reinforce by deciding what is no longer negotiable, your worth, your clarity, your peace, your vision. These are not rewards, they are defaults. And when you treat them as such, the world begins to reflect back your new normal. This is how alignment becomes destiny, not through peak moments, but through practiced posture. To live from the center out is the quietest revolution you will ever undertake. The world trains you in the opposite direction, from performance, from pressure, from panic. It convinces you that to be anything, you must first be seen. That value is confirmed by reaction. That meaning is external, and power must be claimed through constant effort. But all of that collapses when you return to center. The center is not a place, it's a knowing. Not a belief you try to hold on to, it's the ground you finally stop running from. When you live from the center, decisions no longer spin outward from confusion or desire. They rise upward from clarity. Action becomes rooted. Speech becomes clean. Your energy becomes directed, not because you're pushing harder, but because you've stopped leaking into stories that were never yours to carry. This is the final integration, not a dramatic final step, a subtle but irreversible shift. You are no longer chasing alignment. You are living from it, no longer trying to behave differently. You are choosing from a different origin. Everything external becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because you stop giving it the authority to dictate your internal weather. The applause fades. The judgment echoes without entry. You no longer swing from overinflation to collapse. You are steady, not because life is perfect, because your anchor is no longer external. This is where you realize how deeply your past was shaped by outer mirrors. How much of your former self was constructed in reaction to noise. When you live from the center, you stop treating your environment as a report card. You stop begging for proof that you are worthy of your own peace. You already know. You already are. The outer world will still try to pull you off center. People will provoke the old image. Systems will test the old reflexes. But you've spent the time reinforcing. You've seen the pattern, spoken from it, acted from it, fed it daily. So when the test comes, you no longer flinch. You respond, not from reaction, but from recognition. You recognize what serves and what distracts. You recognize who speaks truth and who mirrors your former doubt. You recognize that the stillness you once feared has become your sanctuary. This is not a fantasy. This is the law made flesh. This is what Fox, what Troward, what every serious metaphysical teacher pointed to, not wishful thinking, but demonstration. The point where idea becomes identity, not in isolated moments, but in the whole pattern of your life. You are no longer managing symptoms. You are no longer trying to fix the outer world so the inner one can calm down. You are governing your life from the only seat that was ever stable, your divine center. And from here, everything unfolds differently, not because you manipulate it, because it cannot help but respond. From the center, your vision is clear. You no longer strive. You discern. You no longer hustle. You move with timing. You no longer ask if you're enough. You've dropped the question altogether. This is not the end of your growth. It's the end of distortion, the end of delay, the end of identifying with the survival self and calling it real. You walk forward now not as someone trying to arrive, but as someone already home. The world around you may not understand the shift, but it will notice. Something in you no longer asks, it declares. Something in you no longer contracts. It expands without apology. You are not what happened to you. You are what has always been whole underneath it. And now, you live from that knowing. You breathe from that core. You act from the pattern, not occasionally, but as default. No mask, no permission required, no waiting, just presence, precision, peace. You've come home, and from here, everything becomes possible. Let this moment be still. No more reaching, no more explaining, no more effort to prove you've earned the peace you now feel. It's already yours, not because of what you've achieved, but because of what you've released. The former self has been seen, honored, and set down. You no longer need to carry the weight of becoming. You are already in contact with the pattern. You've spoken from it, breathed from it, felt the discomfort of surrender, and stood through the silence that followed. Now, let it settle. Let the mind grow soft. Let the body unclench. Let the heart recognize that safety is no longer a future event. It is a memory of who you've always been, finally returned. If fear speaks again, you'll meet it differently. If pressure rises, you won't resist. You'll listen. If doubt circles, it won't land. Because the center is now your home, not your destination. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not broken. You are aligned. Keep feeding the pattern with your attention. Keep choosing the tone that matches your design. Let your life now echo the truth you've remembered, not through force, but through faithfulness to the self you never lost, only forgot. The Christ mind lives through you now. It always did. Rest there. Let that be enough.